Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would love to introduce our speaker, Kyra Coker, Chief Financial Officer and President at National Roofing Partners. We are excited to have Kyra with us for a keynote titled Budgeting and Rebuilding Revenue Streams. Welcome, Kyra, and over to you.
Thanks, Brittany and Argyle. I appreciate it. So I'm going to do my best to make this not a boring budgeting meeting, but very much something that I'm passionate about. I think when you come from the finance world, it's easy to get passionate about things that other people may not be, but budgeting and rebuilding revenue streams is really an area where you can turn your accounting department and the way that you go about finance into not just a cost center. It'll always be a cost center, but to also turn it into something that generates some money to the bottom line. So we're going to dig in a little bit today and talk about budgeting, and then also how we can add money to the bottom line. There's a question and answer at the end. So feel free to ask any questions if you can think of anything. I welcome an opportunity to talk finance. So we will get started. So just kind of a brief overview of what we're going to go into today. We're going to go through budgeting processes, strategic initiatives, definitely something that comes up a lot in our roles as CFOs, and then talk about revenue streams and how to balance the financial stability between those strategic initiatives and cash flow. And then we'll wrap up and do a Q&A. So I want to start off just with a brief introduction. Thank you, Brittany, for introducing me, but I wanted to kind of introduce to the way that I have gone about my career in finance, no matter what industry. So I started out in payphones many years ago, and as you can imagine, we were actually very much in a growth mode when I started there. And so I got to experience what that was like for a quick growth, lots of acquisitions, and really burning and churning not only cash, but human capital resources in order to accomplish what we needed to get these acquisitions complete. And then with the boom of cell phones, we also went through a Chapter 11 reorganization bankruptcy and a Chapter 7 closing our doors bankruptcy, which I stayed on through for the majority of in order to wind down the company operations as far as my involvement from a financial side and some operational. And so just in that 7 years that I was at my first job in finance, I definitely got to see the breadth of all things that you can go through in a company, from the startup and definitely acquisition phase into the wind down. And so I've learned a lot over the years, using that as kind of my baseline on what you need to do to budget and how you manage cash flow as a company. And currently I'm in a role in construction. I've actually been in construction finance for about 20 years. And so for those of you that are in any type of industry, you're always dealing with cash flow. But I will say construction is definitely a very high turnover of cash flow that I hadn't experienced before coming into construction. And so just wanted to kind of give that background. So when we look at budgeting process, I think it's definitely something that I'm passionate about, because when you sit down and go through your budgeting, you know, from a financial perspective, you have to make sure that you are being conservative, right? You want to make sure that you're setting your budget to be very cognizant of any resources that are needed for the year and any spend for the year, while also collaborating with other departments and other managers to make sure that the initiatives they want to drive through as a company and the human capital people that they need, you're able to accommodate. when you look at the role of the chief financial officer and how much they really play into how a company will be successful to the bottom line and resources for the year, it's the most integrated part into the rest of the business. And so what we usually do in any finance department that I've been a part of is really what we call a kind of collaborative approach to budgeting. So although you may want to visit with your stakeholders, in fact, I highly encourage you to do that. You want to visit with your stakeholders, your shareholders, your leadership, and make sure that as the finance person and department, you know what those expectations are. Are they looking at top line revenue growth? Are they looking at EBITDA or net profit growth? Is your shareholder stakeholders, are they looking for a blend of both? I'll tell you, as a finance person, I'm usually looking at the bottom line, right? That's the number that is most impactful as I'm looking at it. But what you really start to kind of evolve your approach as you work with these other shareholders and managers within the company is you start to realize how much you need to work with them in order to find out what their needs are. Because the ideal budget is one that has buy-in from everyone, right? It's a lot easier to sit in on the front end during the budgeting process with your sales teams, with your operations teams, if you're in manufacturing, with your systems and processes on the floor, to make sure that they are bought into what the budget is and have a part and a play in it. And the reason why that's important is because in budgeting, I'm a firm believer in the agile approach, which is to consistently have to make adjustments. You're going to set your goals and your budget for the year, but along the way, you may have to pull certain levers and make adjustments in order to accommodate to make sure that you're hitting the numbers that you're expected to hit as a company. And so where this really plays a role, I'm going to blend into kind of the strategic initiatives because I think those go hand in hand with budgeting, is when you're going through the budgeting process, which I'm not sure when most people do it, but I know typically that's something that you start within, the last portion of your third quarter. By then, for the most part, as financial leaders, we should have a really good idea of where you're going to land for the year and kind of what you're starting to look at for your next year, for 2025 or 2026 even and beyond. And so strategic initiatives, meeting with each of your financial leaders and also meeting with your managers of different departments, especially your sales and revenue and operations areas, and finding out, what do they want to do in the next year? What do they want to do in the next 3 years? What do those look like? And if you take the time on the front end when you're budgeting to come up with your yes and no criteria, it's a lot easier to manage throughout the year and make those adjustments that you need to make. I'll give an example. If you're working in manufacturing and one of your strategic initiatives is to launch a new product, you want to make sure that you have your yes nos before you go into the year of what products you're willing to sign off on launching and which ones you're not. Same thing if you're in a construction or a traditional retail business, you want to know what verticals are you willing to go into and which ones are you not. If you're able to do those things on the front end with your teams, it's a lot easier as you go throughout the following year to make those adjustments and also to have those conversations, right? As a team, you agree what are the things we're going to do and what are the things we're not going to do. And if we make those decisions on the front end together, those conversations are a lot easier as your following year goes by. And instead of spending your time trying to figure out the strategic initiatives you're going to do, you can just spend the time trying to figure out how you're going to accomplish the ones that were on your yes list. And this takes me into, revenue streams. This is also something that I find there's quite a bit of value in. Many years ago, I would say that when I thought of finance or shared services, parts of business, I always thought of them as cost centers. right? It's an area of business that, helps operate. It's the back of house. It makes sure that everything is flowing. But what I think is really important is financial leaders, we start to change a little bit of that dynamic and look at accounting and shared services as opportunities of revenue streams, right? It doesn't matter how you go about it necessarily, but it's really important that you do go about it. I'll give you some examples. There are rebate programs. There are buying incentive programs. There's also opportunities for early pay or opportunities for getting points back if you use a credit card, as an example. And think about all of those small dollar figures throughout the year and how much they add up, right? If you, for example, are able to keep your safety mod down on your insurance, are there opportunities for you to get a dividend or rebate back from your workers' comp carrier? Are you taking the time to be proactive and really look at your area of business to see how you can expand and take advantage of bringing revenue in? I think one of the easiest ways I've seen to do that is to actually track it, right? So instead of just putting it into this other income bucket or keeping it simplistic, to really build a plan around it and build a budget that consists of an expectation of generating those revenue streams as you go throughout the year, and holding yourself and your accounting and shared services departments responsible for actually making those revenue goals, just like you would your sales team, right? And really sitting down and thinking about it from a strategic standpoint. We do it with our sales leaders, we do it with our operational leaders, and what we don't often do is take the time as finance leaders to actually do it within our own areas of business that we have probably the most control of, right? So when you're sitting down and planning out your cash flow, and you're planning out what your 12 and 16 week rolling cash flow looks like, are you also taking into account that if you pay your line of credit down, or you make an early payment on something that has principal and interest, that you're taking advantage of those opportunities? Are you using money market accounts? All of those different areas, I would challenge you to really sit down and brainstorm, right? Put down all the different areas where you could generate income, and start having those conversations with your vendors, your suppliers, your strategic relationships. So if you buy a lot of copier paper, or you're shopping at Costco for office supplies, if you're a small business, or even if you're a large business, it doesn't really matter. Those dollars add up. I can tell you that I have seen those be as much as 25% and higher of bottom line net revenue on companies when you make a concerted effort to really concentrate on driving those revenue streams. And here's the reason why that's important. As we, as finance leaders, constantly are trying to figure out, how do you balance cash flow and how do you keep the company stable, right? So as finance people know, when you're growing a company, you're at the most risk of having those cash flow problems, having those moments where you're trying to figure out exactly which levers to pull. And maybe some of you haven't been in a small company and you've only been in large companies, or vice versa, but I see them no matter what size of business you're in, you definitely have those opportunities. And so as finance leaders, it's really important that we make sure that we're protecting that bottom line, that we're protecting our bank accounts, that we're protecting our ability to make sure that we make payroll, and that we can make payroll 4 months down the line and not just today. So how do you do that? I would love to hear during Q&A if anyone has any questions or ideas even on how you're able to balance that. But I think it's always a balancing act that we go through. And so what I've found to be an effective process is to be very, very vigilant in making sure you're doing your forecasting, making sure that you're not just looking at today, that you're not looking at tomorrow, but you're looking 3 months down the road. When you're looking at what's in your pipeline as a company, what's in your backlog, you need to be very well aware of what's coming into your company each quarter, each month, each day, so that you can make the appropriate decisions and make those adjustments to your budget as you go throughout the year. It's very, very important in the positions that we're in that you're able to have your team's confidence that you are going to make sure that you're watching and keeping those things stable. So before we get into Q&A, I really wanted to just kind of summarize and give some final tips and takeaways. You know, we talked about it briefly, or I talked about it briefly, but understanding your stakeholders' expectations. I think before you even go into your budgeting process, this is a very, very big part of what you need to do, because as you're leading the charge to make sure that the financial means are there to carry out strategic initiatives and all those other things, you need to first and foremost understand what the expectation is for you, what the expectation is on the company from a financial standpoint and from a goals and vision standpoint. You have to understand. You also need to make sure that you understand what the short-term and long-term expectations are. If your company is looking at possibly some sort of succession planning in the future, or looking at how to save money on taxes, another item may be looking at possibly selling in the future as part of a succession planning, or maybe creating an ESOP where your employees are owning. You definitely want to make sure that as the finance leader, you understand those expectations so that you can make the appropriate decisions with your accounting team, and really stay in front of those. The second item was the inclusive budgeting. This is really important so that your entire management team is aligned in how you're going to spend money and when you're going to spend money. And making sure that as you do your budgeting, you give the flexibility of yourself to adjust the budget throughout the year, depending on where your revenue numbers are coming in and the cost and inflation and things like that, that you have the flexibility to be able to make those adjustments and still hit those top and or bottom line expectations that you were looking to hit for the year. And then turning your accounting and shared services into a profit center. If you're not doing it, if you're not fully taking advantage of it, that's something that as finance leaders you can really bring as a value add to your companies. And knowing your yes, no criteria before the year starts. I touched on it briefly, but that to me is really key. It goes back to that being aligned and understanding expectations. It's also knowing as a team, what are we willing to do and what are we not willing to do? It's balance. So before I go into the Q&A, just really, truly balance what you do along with how you manage risk and initiatives for your company. So I'll jump into Q&A, Brittany, if that's okay.
Of course. Yeah, so Kyra, this first question that came through, how can finance teams align agile budgeting with organizational strategy to ensure both short-term flexibility and that they also achieve long-term goals?
So I think it's really important to set those expectations and then figure out what is the most important, that bottom line number or that top line number, so that as a finance professional, you know both short term and long term what your stakeholders are looking to meet. For example, if bottom line is really important and they want to make sure you make at least a 10% EBITDA, or they have a very specific number in mind, you want to make sure that you're doing everything within your power to be aligned with your teams to do that. Or if they're planning to sell in the future, or they've got an ESOP or something like that, making sure that those plans align and you can make adjustments. You want to make sure there's a part of your budget that's absolute, right? That's your absolute, and then everything else is adjusted based on your actual needs that you do have throughout the year.
Excellent. Thank you. This next question, how can agile budgeting help organizations prepare for future disruptions and ensure that they remain resilient?
That's a really good question. I think I somewhat answered it in the previous, just making sure you have that absolute, but also making sure that you have built in contingencies, right? I always have a contingency built into our budgets, even on the construction side. Or if it's your actual main budget for operating expenses for the year, you want to make sure you have that contingency that you can draw from in order to take care of those unexpected expenses and pivot quickly. You have to pivot quickly.
Great. Thanks, Myra. It looks like we have a couple other questions. This next one, what role does scenario planning play in fostering resilience and adaptability within finance teams?
Oh, I love that. That's also kind of a fun exercise, right? It's where you come up with your plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. Sometimes we go to what, like plan X, and that's coming through for each quarter, each month, each year. If this happens, then this is the next step I'm going to take. For example, if in quarter one we expect to have $50 million in revenue and 25 million in backlog, and that doesn't happen, what levers are you going to take to make sure that for quarter two you have the financial means to make it through without the revenue that came in quarter one?
Excellent. Thank you. And this next question, how can CFOs balance the need for innovation and revenue generation while also managing risks that are associated with new ventures or markets?
I would say that's often one of the biggest struggles I've had in my career. And the reason is that sometimes as finance, we're kind of looked at as the no people, right? Our job is to protect the risk. And sometimes I know for myself, even the natural reaction is to say no to these new ideas that are not proven. And that's again why it's so important to have your yes nos before you ever go into the year, right? So you want to sit down and make your management team a cohesive decision making process together, right? So you sit down and you discuss, what are my yes nos? And you collaborate on the front end and do the research to make sure that you have the buy-in from everyone, including you in finance, before those go through the process. And that makes it so much easier on you to say, let's say at the end of June, you have one of your revenue generation teams coming to you and they say, oh, we've got this great idea. We've got something we want to do. And it's a really great opportunity to look at those yes nos, right? So as a leadership team, we made a decision that this year we would only go into verticals that were directly related to facilities maintenance or something like that. But we also made a decision that our absolute no's were anything that was related to drone technology. I'm throwing out an example, although that would be kind of crazy, but I think that's where it's really important to know those things. Does it fit in the yes bucket or does it fit in the no bucket? And if it fits in the yes, then our job is to really vet that out and make sure that we make a qualified decision and whether or not we're going to pursue it as an opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kyra. It looks like we have time to squeeze in at least two more questions. This next one is just asking, I guess, what would your top insights be on rebuilding revenue streams overall from a broader standpoint?
I think that my biggest insights there would really be to be open-minded and also be very entrepreneurial in spirit when looking at those things, right? So as finance people, sometimes it's difficult for us to see the gray area, but we really need to make sure that we're being open-minded enough to know that there are so many ideas out there that have led to major innovations, not only in companies, but as a society. So you have to make sure you take that role and you balance the need for innovation and pushing forward with your need to make sure that you're managing cash flow. And as finance leaders, the biggest insight there is that if you do your planning up front and you're constantly looking into the future to see where your financial stance is going to be and how much money you have and what your resources are, it makes it so much easier to have those conversations and to be able to look at those innovative ideas, because you already know how much money you have to put to it and what levers you need to pull in order to make those things happen. It's so much easier than flying by the seat of your pants and only knowing what your cash is for this week or next week, and not knowing whether you have the ability to make those decisions.
Great, thank you. We actually had another question come through. What is your advice on managing volatility in top line growth?
That's a hard one. That goes back to that question that you have to ask your stakeholders on: what are you looking for? Are you looking for expectations on bottom line growth or top line growth? And know that if the expectation is top line growth, then our job as a finance leader is to, while appropriately making sure that you have cash flow and looking at the bottom line, you have to make sure that the people that need to know when there isn't an appropriate amount of pipeline and backlog to actually make those top line numbers. And I'm a firm believer that as finance leaders, we hold the most ability to be able to show that there are red flags or things that are not happening in our business that need to happen. You should at any given time know what your closing ratios are. You should know what your metrics are on your sales team so that you know whether or not they have the ability to meet those top line numbers. And if not, then you need to make sure that you're raising your hand and getting involvement from other leadership to put eyes on that and resources and make the adjustments necessary to put our focus in areas where you can get more top line revenue.
Thank you, Kyra. I think this is a pretty good question, kind of a hard question, but can close out with, can you make any predictions as to what the biggest challenges will be for, I guess, the remainder of this year and then into the new year?
I think we all are looking at interest rates and looking at the election. And without really getting into politics, I think there are a lot of things as finance leaders that are hard to predict until we see what's going to happen there. So you really need to know whether or not all of those tax laws and things that are currently set to be sunset at the end of next year, is that going to happen? And kind of where interest rates are going to go. So my only prediction is that there's not much that we can predict. I think you just have to make sure that you are looking at, as a company, and what your industry is, what that looks like, and how you can make sure that you're evolving to meet the needs that you think are going to be in front of you, and having contingency plans and having planned out scenarios and a very, very good idea of what your budget is no matter what happens.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Kyra, for such an insightful keynote. And thank you, everyone, for those excellent questions. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event. And our next session will begin shortly at 2:40 Eastern, which will be a panel titled Finance Talent Focus, Cultivating a Please click on the join button that will appear on your screen to be redirected. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, Kyra.
Thanks. Thank you very much.